Jesus actually started to exude blood during Gethsemane. Prophetically, this has significance for us as Christians because the word Gethsemane means olive press. So you just get the sense that the weight of the sins of the world was actually pressing on Jesus. Like the olives that were being pressed at the Garden of Gethsemane, he started to exude blood, the blood that was our redemption.
Welcome to the Innovative Church Leaders Podcast. I'm your host, Eric Bryant. In every episode, we bring in guests who will inspire, encourage you to be more effective in your mission field. Well, today on the Innovative Church Leaders Podcast, I have with me Dr. Raphael Samuel. How are you doing?
Great to be on your podcast, and thank you for all your work that you're doing for the kingdom.
Well, and I appreciate your work. I came across you there at Apologetics Canada, a great resource for pastors, apologeticscanada.com, church leaders alike, so many great resources on your YouTube channel. There's a podcast that you guys have. And I was especially intrigued by you. You are a medical doctor. And I
Yes.
think one of your specialties is looking at the death of Jesus and the proof, the evidences of who Jesus really is because of what happened at the cross.
Yes, absolutely. The death and resurrection of the Jesus is essentially the central claim of Christianity. And if it is false, Christianity is false, essentially. But the interesting thing about this is that this is a historical event. It happened at a specific time in history, at a particular geographical location, and involved specific historical people. And very often people will just dismiss the historicity of both the resurrection and the death of Jesus. But we need not confuse the theological meaning and significance of the historic events versus the actual occurrence of the historical event. It's important to differentiate between the two.
Yeah, that's really important, I think, distinction to make. You know, from my understanding, all scholars, including secular scholars, non-Christian scholars, say there is plenty of actual proof that Jesus was a real person who was crucified under Pontius Pilate. Maybe talk a little bit about, as a medical expert, some of what you read in the gospel accounts that disprove this idea that Jesus didn't really die or that he was, just asleep before waking up later. Talk a little bit about some of those evidences you've seen.
Well, we know both from the historical record as well as from archaeology specific aspects of Roman crucifixion. There was a very distinct process that crucifixion involved, and this is detailed throughout numerous historical records. We know that up to about 6,000 people were actually crucified via the Appian Way, along the Appian Way during the Spartacus rebellion. Spartacus was the famous slave. The interesting thing was that the Romans didn't actually invent crucifixion, but they perfected it. And the point of Roman crucifixion was twofold. First, to produce a slow, painful death by torture. And secondly, it was to be a public and a maximally humiliating death. So, from various historical records and from various skeletal finds, actually, just to detour onto the skeletal finds, scholars were quite puzzled why there were so few skeletal finds. And the first skeletal find was only discovered in 1968 in Jerusalem, actually. And an ossuary, which is a bone box used during this Second Temple period, was discovered in North Jerusalem. And it was belonging to a young Jewish man who lived in the first century, Yehohanan ben Hakor. And they found a nail through 0.5-inch eye nail going through the calcaneus of his, which is the heel bone of the leg. And since then, there have been 3 other skeletal finds of victims of crucifixions. So what we know from the historical record and from this archaeology compared to the gospel accounts, you will find such a remarkable correspondence between these records and the gospel accounts. Firstly, we know that all victims were tortured before crucifixion. Authors say that they were scourged. Authors like Josephus, they were beaten. And this was important because the victim needed to be actually weakened. To try and nail a grown man to the cross, it's going to be a lot of hard work for the soldiers if he's not physically exhausted and weakened prior to that act. So we know that they were tortured with all sorts of tortures, and suddenly the victim that was found in Cambridgeshire in England, they found that several of his ribs, actually 6 of his ribs, were broken, and his bones showed signs of extreme torture. And this is according to the archaeological report. And we know from the case of Jesus was scourged. Perhaps there were actually 2 scourgings, because the gospel mentions 2 accounts of the scourgings. One was just prior to judgment, as a form of punishment, where Pilate was just trying to entice the crowds to actually release him. But the proper scourging, which is termed flagellation, actually occurred after the death sentence was given. And we know from Josephus particularly that this was extremely brutal, and from various other historical records, there were normally 2 lictors. Lictors are people that actually perform the whooping. They used the short whip, which is called the flagrum, and this had leather stripes, and attached to the leather stripes was these small metal balls, and interweaved between them was actually animal bones, most commonly sheep. Now, the purpose of the small metal balls was actually to underlying tissue bleeding, which medically we call contusions, and the sheep bones was actually probably the most gruesome of it all, because it was sharp and it ripped into people's flesh. The flesh was actually left into shreds. We have actually an image, the earliest recorded image of a crucifixion, and I'd encourage your pastors and your viewers to actually look it up. It's called a Puteoli graffiti, and this was discovered in Puteoli in Italy, and it's actually associated with the name Alcima, which was a lady, and we're not really sure whether she was the person who actually did this graffiti or she was actually the victim. And one thing that's particularly obvious about this graffiti is the deep lacerations that you can easily see growing across the back, the buttocks, and the legs. And there's been reports of people actually dying from this flagellation. Bones sometimes were exposed, according to Josephus. And the time that you actually lasted on the cross before you died depended on the severity of the scourging. Now, we know from Jesus's case, from the gospel accounts, he was beaten twice. He was beaten at both trials, the Roman trial and at the high priest. He underwent scourging, but also interestingly, from a medical point of view, Luke describes something in the Garden of Gethsemane, which the Greek actually suggests, and the actual translation is that Jesus' sweat became like drops of blood. Now, that is a rare medical condition known as hematohydrosis, where you actually sweat blood. Very interesting. It occurs largely in the pediatric population, and there's numerous medical case reports of this actually occurring and how to treat it, where under states of intense emotional anxiety or stress, the patient would actually sweat blood. And it's fascinating that Jesus actually started to exude blood during Gethsemane. Prophetically, this has significance for us as Christians because the word Gethsemane comes from Gat Shemanim, which means olive press. So you just get the sense that the weight of the sins of the world was actually pressing on Jesus. And like the olive oil, like the olives that were being pressed at the Garden of Gethsemane, he started to exude blood, the blood that was our redemption.
Hmm.
Thereafter, they were forced to carry the patibulum. Plutarch, a Roman writer, notes about this. Now, the patibulum is the horizontal beam of the cross. It is unlikely that Jesus carried the entire cross. I don't think it would be physically possible to carry the entire cross, although this is depicted in both numerous pictures and in movies. The stipes, which is the upright beam, was normally fixed in the ground. So it would have been fixed at Golgotha. It would have been fixed as just an upright pole, or sometimes they even used just trees that were there. And then he would have had to carry the horizontal beam, the patibulum, which weighed about 34 to 75 pounds, which for a week that's already undergone dehydration, beating, and scourging, that in Jesus' case, it was a tough task. And we can see from the gospel accounts just how weak Jesus was because he wasn't able to carry that patibulum. Simon of Cyrene had to actually carry that patibulum. So it already gives us a picture of just the physiological and pathophysiological processes that are actually going on in Jesus' body at this time.
Hmm.
And then we know that prior to this, he wore a crown of thorns. And this also is very interesting archaeologically because a favorite game played by the Romans was called the game of the king. And we have inscriptions of this type of game where they played with dice. And here was a prisoner who actually claimed to be the king of the Jews. So it fitted in perfect with this game. So this game involved using a slave, and there were markings on the pavement, and whoever won the game got to choose the type of torture for the victim. And Jesus just fitted perfectly in this game. So again, you get this remarkable historical correspondence between the gospels and history. Jesus then was stripped of his robe, which would have been a really painful event because the wounds would have temporarily sealed, and then this would have actually reopened all the wounds. Psalm 22 speaks quite interestingly of this entire crucifixion process 1,000 years before
Yeah.
it. And one of those verses in the Psalms, David speaks about my arms and my legs are out of joint. Now, they would have tied the patibulum up and raised it after nailing Jesus to the cross, which would have essentially dislocated both his wrists and his shoulders. So, how David could actually predict this, we know that David's arms and legs were not dislocated. There certainly is no biblical account of this. But again, just the depth of the prophecy here. And then the position in which they were crucified varied, almost as Josephus speaks about it as just for jest. The Roman executioners would crucify people in different positions. And we know that the victim from Gavello differed different from the victim found in Israel, Yohanan. One nail was used for the victim in Gavello, Italy, going through both heel bones, whereas two nails were used in the case of Yohanan, and his feet was actually attached to the side of the upright stipes. Again, moving forward on this, after that, it's very fascinating that, again, whether Jesus was crucified on a Latin cross or a tau cross is a T-shaped cross. A Latin cross is the traditional cross that we see, which has a little bit of an extra upright beam emerging. We don't really know which type of cross Jesus was crucified on. Certainly the tau or the T-shaped cross was more common. However, there's some misrepresentation in some of the traditional pictures of Jesus that he was on a really tall cross. Now, this wasn't actually the purpose of crucifixion. The purpose of crucifixion was humiliation. So you had to be at the eye level of your accusers.
Mm.
And the purpose of that was so that they could actually taunt you and mock you. And all the crosses that we know from history were short crosses. A vast majority of them were short crosses. And we know this from the gospel accounts because the standard Roman spear was about 5 to 6 feet. And if Jesus was pierced with that, he would have been on a short cross. Likewise, the a hyssop stalk is about 20 inches. So Jesus was offered sour vinegar and wine on that. So all in keeping with a short cross, and certainly the conversations that happened, certainly keeping with a short cross as well.
Interesting.
And the last point I just want to make about this is just the remarkable accuracy of John's testimony, which can only really be eyewitness testimony, when he talks about the piercing of Jesus' side.
Mm-hmm.
Now, we know from historical records, particularly Quintilian, who's a Roman writer, he speaks that the executioners did not forbid the burial of the bodies as long as they were struck or they were pierced. So, and we know also from Josephus, a riot broke out because the Romans did not want to allow burial of some of the Jewish victims. So it's very important in Jewish tradition to actually bury the victim on the day that death occurred. But John talks about blood and water both coming out. Now, from a physician who spent numerous times in both ICU and dealing with trauma patients, something occurs in a critically ill patient very rapidly. There's a protein called albumin which drops, the levels drop, and then water, or what we call transudate, but it's essentially water primarily, starts entering into the outer parts of the lung, parts of the abdomen, and around the heart. And we have to often put in chest drains to sometimes remove some of this water. And John says specifically water and blood. So the spear first would have encountered that pleural effusion, which was filled with water, and then blood would have come out. Remarkable eyewitness testimony of someone who was actually there.
Well, and it's amazing when you read Psalm 22, as you suggested, Isaiah 53, the prophets really describing what Jesus endured, with your medical experience, reminding us he was absolutely killed. The Romans knew how to do crucifixion. They did not mess that up. I
Yes,
wanted to shift to a really interesting topic. And obviously, for those who are trying to reach folks and helping them understand the theological reason for the crucifixion, not just the proof of it, the beauty of the resurrection, and certainly there's so much evidence of it, but there's also evidence of God in the human body. Maybe in just a couple minutes, share what you have experienced as a doctor and even as an apologist. How have you used the human body to point people towards God?
well, the human body is actually a remarkable entity. The human brain is universally accepted as the most complex object in the universe. It has trillions of connections of neurons between the different synapses, really capable of abstract thought, art, mathematics, language. Phenomenal. There's no other object in the universe that is as complex, apart from God himself, than the human brain and the human mind. At least three aspects of evidence for God from medicine and from the human body that I would put forward first is that inside each of our cells we have something called DNA. DNA is actually a biological structure that occurs in the form of an alphabet. So there are four recurring biological structures in DNA, which are called bases, and they correspond to, we give them the term A, T, C, and G. Now, the interesting concept about DNA is that its function is not related to the chemistry of those bases. but the sequence or the arrangement of those bases. You may be familiar with something called SETI, the search for extraterrestrial intelligence. So
Yeah.
the United States government and other governments throughout the world put up these huge satellite dishes everywhere to look in outer space for complex patterns, sounds, events that they could pick up that would imply intelligence. And after decades and decades of waiting, they've still come up with absolutely zero. But inside each of our 300 trillion cells, there is a complex code that is both specific and complex. And we know that information only comes from a mind, and no information, no life. That's the remarkable thing. DNA is both specific, meaning that it has meaning and function. It is both complex, meaning it is really extensive. There's billions of base pairs, and God has actually put his signature in each of our cells. And then quickly, one of the areas of my interest is consciousness as evidence for the existence of the soul. The brain is extremely complex, but there's a distinct difference between the subjectiveness of consciousness and the physical reality of the brain. Now, as Christians, traditionally, we've always subscribed to the theory of substance dualism, meaning that we have bodies and we have minds. But the atheists is a bit of a predicament here because they believe that the mind is the brain and the brain is the mind, that there's no difference between that. Now, if you come to accept that precept, that reductionism, you have a problem because number one, you cannot account for free will. We are just automatic robots that chemical stimulation and random flow of chemical modules and molecules just result in us making decisions. So we chemically programmed. So basically, to be an atheist means that you deny the option of free will. You also deny concepts like the subjectivity of how a strawberry tastes or what is love. You pre-programmed. So it's an immense obstacle to the path of atheism. But as Christians and as theists, this has lined up perfectly with our worldview. We have always believed that we both have a mind and a body, and this is in line with our theory. And lastly, what I often speak about is just the miracle of miracles. All you need is one miracle to have occurred, and the entire house of cards of the atheist falls down, because the atheist does not believe in anything supernatural, anything beyond time, energy, and matter. Anything beyond that is physical. And we actually have some really good, strong evidence for numerous miracles actually occurring. So those were the three aspects that, suddenly point towards the existence of God and the existence of a soul.
I love it. I've heard someone describe, even the Big Bang is a miracle,
Yes.
creation out of nothing. So if you believe in that one miracle, then why not believe in all the others? Well, Dr. Raphael Samuel, thank you so much for taking the time with us. apologeticscanada.com is the website. Thank you so much. Keep up your great work.
Great. Thank you for having me on.
Thanks for joining us for the Innovative Church Leaders Podcast. Go to my website, ericbryant.org, for my newsletter and free resources.